great turnout. I am Professor Solimar Otero. I am the director of the Folklore Institute and on the committee for the Colloquium, the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology Colloquium, and I welcome all of you here. It's wonderful to see you all and have such a great turnout. So I want to thank my fellow Colloquium members, Rebecca Dirksen, Joseph Johnson, and Holly Matthews for their work in getting this series together. And I just wanted to pitch our very last event of the semester on Friday, April 22nd at 4 p.m. Aisha Belizo de Jesus, Professor of American Studies from Princeton University, is going to be doing a talk over Zoom, and it is entitled Blame to Death, Excited Delirium, Police Violence, and Spirit Activism. And that is part of also, besides our colloquium series, the 60th anniversary colloquium series for the African Studies program, as well as being sponsored by the Journal of Folklore Research, the Department of Anthropology, the Department of History, and the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies. So please join us for that if you can. And today we are very happy to have John Baker Jr. with us today. But to introduce him is Professor Brandon Barker, who is an assistant professor of folklore in the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology and affiliate faculty in the cognitive science at Indiana University here in Bloomington. Brandon specializes in the folklore of the United States, especially folklore of the southern states, American country music, and children's folklore. But he publishes on a wide variety of topics in folklore and cognitive science, ranging from folk music and supernatural legends to children's play with perceptual illusions and the science of animal cognition. So join me in welcoming Dr. Brandon.
So I know you all have heard me talk about John's visit. You know how excited I've been about this for a really long time. Actually, I kind of can't believe that the day is here. And also knowing that some of us have exams to get to, and I'm really proud of you for showing up. John's talk is going to be very special for this group. So well done. I'm going to try to move past and not take all of, as my friend Ray Cashman says, the works and miracles that John Baker Jr. has pulled off. So in Washingtons of Wessyngton Plantation, let me try that again. In Washingtons of Wessyngton Plantation, my family's journey of freedom, my friend John Baker Jr. has completed the most thorough genealogical and oral history study of any Upland South tobacco plantation's owners, enslaved peoples, and African American descendants. His publisher, Atria, a division of Simon & Schuster, names John's book a groundbreaking work of history and a deeply personal journey of discovery. The Washingtons of Wessyngton Plantation is an uplifting story of survival and family that gives fresh insight into the institution of slavery and its ongoing legacy today. So John's book is all of those things and more, as you all know, having read it. The book received a national award from the American Association of State and Local History Associations. And in 2014, there was an exhibit at the Tennessee State Museum that was visited by no less than 70,000 visitors. And that particular exhibit won an award from the American Association for State and Local History Museums. Like I say, I want to save as much time as possible. But I just want to mention that, and you all in my class know that, John's work is historical. And John's work has captured for us a kind of erroneous anonymity and filled it in with people's faces and names and meaning that we now get to have and keep forever. And John does that, and the book represents that. You know that he's created important texts like the family trees, and you'll get to see one in person today. But also, John goes out into the world to share his story several times a year at Westington Plantation, inviting descendants of the enslaved people of Westington's Plantation, and brings them to the place to show them where their ancestors lived. He takes them out sometimes to the cemetery where he sings his beautiful songs. I thank, of course, the Colloquium Committee for inviting John, the Archives of Traditional Music, where we interviewed John today, and he did a beautiful rendition of Walk With Me, Lord. It was moving. That said, what John does is, from creating history and going and facing the public, is really produce art. And so you'll get to see something today that is so good, the history is so good, that it's going to rise to the level of art. So help me welcome my friend John Baker Jr.
Thanks so much for inviting me. For more than 40 years now, I've conducted genealogical and historical research on a plantation in Robertson County, Tennessee called Westington. My research started when I was in the 7th grade, flipping through a social studies textbook, and I came to this photograph. And for some reason, I was drawn to this photograph thinking the individuals looked like people that I knew, but I had no idea at the time that I was actually looking at my own great-great-grandfather and mother. So when I got out of school for summer vacation, it was the plantation's 160th anniversary. So they had a photograph of the white Washington family that founded the plantation and this one. So my maternal grandmother happened to be visiting us from Chicago, and she spent the weekend with one of her older brothers, and she called my mother and told her to come pick her up and to have me to bring a camera. And I said, Mama, why does Big Mama want me to bring the camera out to Uncle Bob's? He lived out in the country. She said, boy, get the camera and you'll find out when you get there. My mother was very concerned. So when I got there, my grandmother and my uncle had the newspaper spread out on the kitchen table. And I said, this is what you wanted me to copy, Big Mama? And she said, yeah. And I said, who was that? I said, that picture's in our 7th grade social studies book. So she pointed and she said, that's my grandfather, and he was the cook at Washington, and that's how we got the Washington surname, which mostly everyone refers to Westington as Washington. And then she said, that's my grandmother. And so my grandmother was excited about seeing the photograph because they passed away before she was born, but her brother was much older than she was, and he knew them personally. And so he said, call out to Washington and tell them who you are. And so he said, everything is still intact, the big house, the slave cabins, and so forth. So the very next morning, I called out to Westington, and I spoke to Ann Consolvin Talbot, and she was a 6th-generation descendant of Joseph Washington, who founded the plantation in 1796. So I told her I'd seen the newspaper article and I was interested in my family's history, so she brought me out, invited me out to the plantation. And when I went out there, she showed me this portrait of my great-great-grandfather, Emanuel Washington, and he was born on the plantation April 23rd, 1824, and he died there in 1907. The Washington family commissioned Maria Howard Wheaton to paint his portrait, and this portrait now is worth about $25,000. Ms. Talbot also brought out about 12 legal-sized documents which recorded the births of the slaves on the plantation from 1795 to 1860. So I was able to find my great-great-grandfather's exact date of birth. Emanuel, born April 23rd, 1824, and my great-great-grandmother, Henny, was born May 26, 1837. This is the entrance gate at Westington, and when I was a small child, about 5 years old, my grandfather would take me for a ride in the country every Sunday after church. So often we would come up to the entrance gate and he would slow down or stop and he would point and he said, that's Washington, that's where your grandmother's family came from. Which at 5 I knew my grandmother was a Washington, but that's as far as it went. So when Miss Talbot invited me out there and I had to have my mother drive me out at that time, as soon as I got to the entrance gate, it dawned on me what my grandfather was telling me, that my family's history went back there some 200 years. This is the Westington Mansion, and it was started in 1815 and completed in 1819, and it's on the historical register of National Register of Historic Places, and it was built entirely by slave labor. And the first trip at Westington was like stepping back in time. They had all the original furnishings. They had other portraits of some of the former slaves. Some of the furnishings have been passed down to some of the slave descendants. It's owned by their direct descendants today. This is the Washington family crest, and the Washington's family history goes back to the 12th century to their ancestor William D. Hertburn. And he was given an estate called Westington for military service by one of the kings of England. And so they became known as D. Westington, and when they came to America in the 1600s, they changed it to Washington. So the Washingtons that founded Westington named the plantation in honor of their ancestors. And this is some of the slave cabins at Westington, and when I started my research, there were about 10 of them still there. In 1860, there were 40 log cabins which housed 274 individuals, which was the largest slave population in the state of Tennessee at the time. And this is some photographs that I took of some of the cabins in about 1976 with a one-step camera, and many of you are not old enough to remember those. And this is when I participated in an archaeological dig on the plantation in 1993. And the actual spot we're digging in is where my great-great-grandmother and father's house used to be. And Miss Talbot also took me to the slave cemetery at Westington, and my great-great-grandfather and mother are buried there, as well as some of my earlier ancestors. The Washingtons deposited all their family records from the plantation in the Tennessee State Library and Archives in the 1960s. It's now on 69 rolls of microfilm, but when I started the research, none of it had been microfilm, so I was looking at original documents. There's over 11,000 documents in this collection. It includes letters, photographs, plantation records, a lot of correspondence. This is what's going on the plantation. The second owner of the plantation was George A. Washington, and so his father turned the plantation's management over to him at a young age. So he would go to New Orleans to sell produce from the plantation. He would go to Virginia and Maryland to purchase slaves, and he would go to New York to invest in the stock market. So while he was away, his wife, his mother, and the plantation overseer would write letters, what's going on, which slaves died, who had a baby, who ran away, all types of stuff. Even when the Cherokees came up to the big house to get food and water before they were driven out on the Trail of Tears, there's especially a lot of information during the Civil War period. This document is where my great-great-grandfather, Emanuel, agreed to work for the Washington family for $125 a year after he was emancipated as the cook. And this is his cornbread recipe, and it's very good. This is Joseph Washington, and he was born in Southampton County, Virginia, July 8, 1770. He died at Westington in 1848. He came from Southampton County, Virginia, with his uncle and about 25 other individuals. He was engaged to one of his first cousins, Roseanne Branch, and on the way to Tennessee, they met other settlers, so she dumped him for one of the new settlers. So he came on to Springfield and visited one of his cousins, Colonel Archer Cheatham. At this time, this lady was a baby. And so him being a bachelor, they said, well, Joseph, when are you going to get married? He said, well, I'll just wait till this girl grows up and I'll marry her, which is what he did in 1812 when she was 16 and he was 42, which her dad was the wealthiest man in the county, so that's probably one of the reasons. Okay, this is the route that Mr. Washington and the slaves would have taken to Robertson County, Tennessee, and this would have taken about 3.5 months walking, and some of the slaves passed on to their direct descendants if they walked every step of the way. And this is George A. Washington. He's Mary and Joseph's son, who I mentioned earlier. He was born at Westington in 1815 and died there in 1892. This is his second wife, Jane Smith. She was born in Florence, Alabama in 1830 and died in Nashville in the home of her daughter in 1894. This is a photograph I took of Westington 2 years ago. And this is a map that I drew of Westington. This lists the big house. That was an office. That was the kitchen, a smokehouse, and other buildings, and I have those buildings listed here. And Brandon mentioned earlier that the Tennessee State Museum did an exhibit based on my book called Slaves and Slaveholders of Westington Plantation. And for that, they built a model which showed how the plantation functioned and all the outbuilding slave cabins. It was entirely self-sufficient. And at its peak, the plantation encompassed 13,100 acres. This is another shot of them. This is a blacksmith shop from the plantation. This was taken in the 1890s. And this is some of the other buildings in the wintertime. And I think this was taken in 1895. Slave population and source of slaves at Westington. Mr. Washington in Virginia owned 5 slaves in Sussex and Southampton County, Virginias. In 1813, he owned 33 slaves. By 1820, he was the second largest slaveholder in our county, second only to his father-in-law, Archer Cheatham, owning 44. By 1830, he had owned 80. 1840, 109. 1850, 143. 1860, 274, making them the largest slaveholders in the state of Tennessee. Mr. Washington received 16 slaves from 1801 to 28 by inheritance from one of his brothers that never married, that died early, his father and other relatives. Joseph and George Washington purchased 125 slaves from 1801 to 1843, and there was approximately 195 slaves born on the plantation from 1795 to 1860. And from 1796 to 1865, when the emancipation came, there were over 450 individuals that had been enslaved on the plantation. And this is one of the pages from the slave birth register I mentioned, starting from 1795 to 1860. This is a slave bill of sale, and in the Washington family collection, there's about 40 slave bills of sale from 1801 to 1843. This one is for my great-great-great-grandmother. When our family first came over from Africa, they were enslaved in Sussex County, Virginia by Colonel Michael Blow, who was a Revolutionary War colonel. He owned a plantation of about 50 slaves, and when he passed away in 1797, he gave 15 of them to one of his sons, Micaiah Blow, which included my family. And then in a couple of years, Micaiah became heavily indebted, so he mortgaged some of the land he inherited, and he sold my great-great-great-grandmother, Jenny, at age 10, and her sister Sarah, age 12. And Joseph Washington brought them to Tennessee in 1802. And our family is the earliest on the plantation that can be tracked down to direct descendants. And there's been 11 generations of our family that have lived in Robertson County since then. And this is a document I created where I listed all the slave bills of sale from 1801 through 43, and I list the slave's name, the age at the time that they were purchased, if listed, the date that they were purchased, where they were purchased from, if it was a single purchase or an entire family, the amount that they were purchased for, and the previous owner. This family is also this is my great-great-great-great-grandfather and mother on my great-great-grandmother's side that was on the photograph. And the Washingtons purchased the entire family for $1,590. So that's my fourth great, and this 11-month-old is my three great-grandmother, the mother, the lady on the photograph that I mentioned earlier. You could get a mortgage on slaves like any other property. So the Union Bank of Nashville loaned a plantation owner enough money to purchase 14 slaves, and he had bad crops or whatever. He was unable to pay for the slaves. So the bank basically repossessed these 14 individuals. And so George A. Washington, who was the second owner of Westington, went to Nashville and purchased all 14 of them and then brought them to the plantation. And this lists the individual prices. This guy, William, was a blacksmith, and he was valued at $800, and then it lists the other individuals. And the prices vary depending on their skills. In 1843, George A. Washington married Margaret Adelaide Lewis, and her dad owned a plantation called Fairfield in Nashville, and he was a close friend to President Andrew Jackson. And as a wedding gift, he gave them 29 slaves for $1. And this included 7 interrelated families. And many of their descendants are still in the county. Slaves sold from Westington. So the Washingtons were so wealthy, it would never necessitated any of them being sold, except for these two gentlemen. This guy was Henry Williamson, and he was born in 1820, and he was sold in New Orleans in 1842. He was very rebellious. He was brought to the plantation when he was, I think, 17 or 18 years old, and his owner received $800, and he actually went back to his former owner's plantation and stole part of the money that he got for selling it. And the sheriff came to the plantation looking for the money, but he never found any of it. The other guy is Davey Washington, and he ran away 4 times before the Washingtons sold him. He was born in 1824, and he actually made it into the state of Indiana before being captured by a sheriff, and he had an axe, and he tried to kill the sheriff versus being brought back to the plantation. Names of Westington slaves. Many slaves at Westington had true African names where I could trace back what tribes they came from. Many of them had biblical names, classical names like Caesar or Pompey. Most slaves named individuals after family members, especially males, because males had a tendency to be sold away from the plantation more so than females. There were many place names, such as America, Axum, which is a city in Ghana, Britain, Carolina Tom. There was already 2 Toms on the plantation, so this one came from South Carolina, so they referred to him as Carolina Tom. There were slaves undoubtedly named by the Washingtons: Harrison, Jackson, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and Washington for the presidents. And then some of the slaves who had close relationships with the white Washingtons or blood ties named their children after some of the white Washingtons. And in the early 2000s, I started the Westington Dna Project, where I got DNA samples from various slave family, descendants, to trace their ancestry to the African tribes or ethnic groups that they came from. And this is also in my book. Labor division on the plantation. Men primarily worked under a task system, which meant the owner assigned a certain task: how many acres of tobacco to chop out, feeding the pigs, the horses, or whatever. Of course, they knew how much work an average person could do in a day, so they set this task where it was going to take up your entire day. However, some of the faster workers could accomplish their task early, and they were allowed to work on their own tobacco crops. So Washington would keep up with how much tobacco they raised, and then he would pay them part of that. They were engaged primarily in tobacco production, other crops, blacksmiths, carpenters, stonemasons. There was a large whiskey operation on the plantation. All of the surplus corn that didn't go into feeding the families and the livestock went into making whiskey. There was also a large pork operation, and you could find Washington hams on the most exquisite restaurants as far south as New Orleans and as far north as Philadelphia. and there were also coopers or barrel makers. The women on the plantation were not required to do any outside work if they had children that were under 2 years old. So this was an incentive for them to keep having children, which ultimately increased the wealth of the plantation owner. So they primarily did sewing and weaving, domestic work, processing pork, milking cows, caring for the children. There was also a nursery, like a daycare, so any of the women that had children that were over 2, older women watched over them while their mothers worked. And then they also cared for the elderly and sick and cooked for their own families. And this was a photograph taken in 1907 of black and white sharecroppers on Westington Plantation. This was a woman preparing to do the wash, and here's where they're processing pork, where they killed pigs on the plantation. And at its peak, they needed 42,000 pounds of pork to feed the slave population in the white Washington family. And this is a group of former slave women processing pork, and it was stored in the smokehouse, which this building is still standing. And this is a tobacco field at Westington. And in 1860, the slaves at Westington Plantation produced 250,000 pounds of dark fired tobacco, making them the largest in the United States, second largest in the world. And this would have taken 350 acres based on yields at that time. And this is the smokehouse there at Westington. And each week, the women would line up on Saturday afternoons, and they would get so many pounds of bacon, meal, flour, sugar, vegetables, and so forth, depending on the number of individuals in their household. And this is a group of runaway slaves that I started. The first that I could document, I'm sure there were some earlier, but the first documented one was a slave named Jack. He ran away when he was 18 years old in September of 1838. He was out until October 3rd when he was recaptured, and a $30 reward was offered for his return. And he made it about 50 miles away from the plantation. This other gentleman was Lewis, and he ran away in May of 1840, and he was out for a week and a half. He made it to Evansville, Indiana before he was recaptured. And this is Davey, the gentleman I mentioned earlier. He ran away 4 times, and on the 4th attempt, the Washingtons decided to sell him in the New Orleans slave market. Rebellion and punishment on the plantation. So slaves rebelled against the system by running away, aiding others in running away if they didn't want to take that chance, leaving without permission, fighting overseers, refusing to work, breaking tools, riding draft animals. Some of the former slaves would ride the horses and mules in a race, and then they would be too tired to work, so they were slowing the workforce down. And of course, they had disputes among themselves, so some of them fought one another. Some pretended to be sick. Congregating for church services was stopped after the Paternal Rebellion, which that rebellion sort of put the fear of God in slave owners throughout the country. How this was dealt with was whipping, confinement, not allowing others to visit, or you couldn't go outside the plantation to visit other relatives also, and ultimately sell. I was very fortunate. When I started my research, there was probably 20 to 25 individuals still around that ranged in age from 80 to 107 years old. This is my maternal grandmother, and she passed away when she was 85. And so far, no one in my direct line through the Washingtons has died under 80, going back to the 1700s. And hopefully I won't break our record. This is my grandmother's brother, Bob Washington, and his wife, Maggie Washington. She passed away when she was 99 and a half, and she was the last individual that was around from the beginning of my research. This is Maddie Terry. She was my neighbor and also one of my church members. This is my cousin, Carrie Washington. She worked many years at Westington. She passed away when she was 99. This is Reverend Sam Gardner. He and I also attended the same church. He passed away when he was 98. This is my cousin, Joseph Washington. I met on his 102nd birthday, and he died a week before he turned 107. This is Ann Nixon Cooper, and she's the lady President Obama mentioned voting for him when she was over 100 years old, and she died 19 days before she turned 108. This is Mrs. Maddie Terry, and she told me that her great-grandmother, Sarah, was born at Westington in 1810, and she lived to be 104 years old. So she said she would often gather up all her grandchildren and great-grandchildren and tell them stories about when they were enslaved at Westington. Westington sits high on a hill, and then back behind the big house, it sort of slopes down, and there's slave cabins arranged there. Then the land flattens out, and then there's a stream. And she said that when she was a child, that she and the other adults and children, adult women and children, collected clay, brought it up on the hill where the mansion now stands, and the men molded and made bricks. And she said evidently they knew what they were doing because the house is still standing. She said that her great-grandmother could still thread a needle without glasses at 104 years old and could still chop her own firewood. This is my cousin Joseph when I met him in Mansfield, Ohio on his 102nd birthday. And I had a book of photographs, and he could tell me something about each one of them. And I asked him, did he know my great-great-grandfather and mother? And he said, well, of course I knew them. We lived in handshaking distance. I said, handshaking distance, what's that? And he said, our houses were so close together that you could actually reach out and shake your neighbor's hand. And he also told me that my great-great-grandfather had a beautiful singing voice, and he used to lead most of the songs on the plantation in their services. And this is Mrs. Ann Nixon Cooper. And she said, John, you know what? Since the president called my name, there's been people as far away as Japan that have come to my house to interview me. And she said, they act like I didn't have an interesting life. And she said, I had a very interesting life. She married a prominent dentist in Atlanta. And so she wrote a book called A Century and Some Change, My Life Before the President Called My Name. It's very interesting. And it's also published by Simon & Schuster, who published my book. And before then, I told my editor, I said, y'all should do a book on Mrs. Cooper. So after President Obama mentioned her name, that was a cinch then. Some of the slaves, especially the males, started emancipating themselves at the outbreak of the Civil War before they were officially freed. So Mr. Washington thought, he said, well, he met with 18 of them. And he said, if you will stay here on the plantation, I will pay you $10 a month. So they all agreed. So later on, they got together and said, well, he's just trying to keep us on the plantation. Other people are leaving, we're leaving too. So these are the same 18 ran away, and these are the exact dates that they ran away from the plantation. And some of them enlisted in the Union Army, and I have all these individuals' pension records. So when they were older men, they applied to get a pension for military service. And you had to say who your owners were, how many times you had been sold, how many wives you had, how many kids you had, all this. So it's a genealogical gold mine. And so this one guy, Frank Washington, said in his application, I know that I was 12 years old when the war broke out because the Washingtons didn't start the kids to working until they were 12. And he said by age 12, I was large as most full-grown men. So when Union soldiers came through the area, taking me in to work on the military fortifications in Nashville, he said they grabbed me up too. And he said, I remember my mother running out of the house screaming that he's only 12, but they took him anyway. And this is a group of African-American men in Nashville, the U.S. colored troops in 1864. And this is the military fortifications, Fort Negley, that's in Nashville. And many of the former slaves from Westington helped erect this. After emancipation, some of the former slaves stayed in Nashville. It got down to there was only 3 slaves left on the plantation by the war's end. So some of them were in contraband camps in Nashville for 2 years. So after the war, some of them stayed in Nashville in some of the cities, some of the areas that didn't evolve into African-American neighborhoods. Some of the slaves went up north, out west, all over the country. So my great-great-grandmother and father came back to Westington and worked. My great-great-grandfather worked as the cook, and then some of them as domestics and sharecroppers. So some individuals, white individuals, lost everything they had during the war. So some people sharecropped for them, and when it came time to get paid, they didn't have the money to pay them. So Mr. Washington, due to his investment strategies, he was even wealthier after the war than he was before. So they knew at least if they worked for him, they'd get paid. And this is a timeline of things going on during the war. And this is highlighted in my book as well. And this tells when Washington received orders to protect his property, so he was given a gun. And so it got down to, on the plantation, that Mr. Washington ended up being ran out of town for killing a horse thief who was a Union soldier. So he was in New York a good portion of the war, so his wife and his mother and children would write a lot of letters what's going on the plantation. So that's how I know so much detail. And then they even tell when the Union Army came to the plantation and took 24 men and boys to work on the military fortifications. And this is the Antioch Baptist Church, and it was founded in 1869 by former Westington slaves and others in the community. They also used it as a school, and the parents had to pay $1 per month per child, which was a great sacrifice because they were only making 50 cents a day. And I found that some individuals as old as 40 and 50 years old were going to school to learn to read and write because they realized the significance of education. They also hired one of the original Fisk Jubilee singers to teach school at the church because it was used dually as a church and school. This is production on Westington Plantation from 1860 through 70. The plantation was valued in 1860 at $250,000. Personal property, which included slaves, was $279,000. Mr. Washington's personal property, which would be stocks and bonds after the slaves had been emancipated, $400,000. So he'd be a multimillionaire. The plantation was 13,100 acres in 1860. 1870 is down to 10,000. He sold some of it to some of the former slaves and others that lived in that area. The slaves produced 250,000 pounds of tobacco in 1860. It was down to 45,000. And by so many African Americans leaving the county, production of tobacco in the county dropped 13%. There was 1,200 pigs on the plantation in 1860, only 50 in 1870. 300 cattle down to 35, 50 oxen down to 2, 80 mules down to 6, 29 horses down to 14, 275 sheep down to 50. Livestock value $50,000 and goes down to $8,000. So you can see there was a dramatic change on the plantation after the war. This is an agreement with my great-great-grandfather to work as the cook. So he was to be paid $125 a year. He was to have every other Sunday off. Washington was to provide food and housing, and Emanuel, my great-great-grandfather, was responsible for any lost time. He was to provide his own clothing, responsible for his own doctor's bill. And Washington stated that he had nothing to do with the Emanuel family. That was his own responsibility. And this is another contract with a sharecropper. And Washington provided the land, the tools, and the draft animals like oxen or horses and fertilizer. So Washington provided the housing and food, and he was to receive 2/3 of the crop, and Lewis would receive 1/3. Lewis and his family were obligated to work whenever requested. Lewis was to take care of the draft animals, horses, mules, so forth. Washington didn't want them working for anyone else unless they had his permission. They would be charged for all lost time, and it stated that Lewis was to care for his mother, Caroline, who was elderly, and Lewis was responsible for all his medical bills and his family. And this was a baptism of the Antioch Baptist church members in 1880. And this, I acquired this after the book was published. I did a speaking engagement in Evansville, Indiana, and one of my grandmother's cousins she just passed away a couple of months ago. She was 98. So she gave me this picture, and she also had the original photograph that I saw in my 7th grade social studies book. So she let me have that one as well. And she also gave me this one, which is her mother with her school class in the early 1900s. This is Rachel Washington Terry and Wiley Terry. They were both born slaves on Westington Plantation. And Wiley and 2 of his sons purchased 429 acres of land, part of which was part of the plantation that they had formerly been enslaved on. Do any of you all know Method Man the rapper? Are you too young? Okay. This is his great-great-great-grandmother and father. And this is their son, Sally Terry, and this is his family in front of their 1918 Model T Ford, and they're the first African Americans that I could document that owned the car. They also donated some of their land to form a school for African Americans before the county did. And this is Alonzo Wright, and he was the first millionaire, African American millionaire in Cleveland, Ohio, and his grandfather, Ford Washington, was born enslaved at Westington. And at one time, he was the largest employer of African Americans in the United States. And this is Fannie Ricks Keaton Garrison Williams and her husband, Wesley Williams. And so after emancipation, many of the slaves never came back, so the Washingtons hired other whites and other African Americans. So I got this photograph from a portrait from my cousin Carrie Williams, who passed away when she was 99. And so almost all the family said Fannie was full-blooded Cherokee, which she looks Native American. So I had a DNA test done on one of her great-great-grandsons through her maternal line, and it showed that she had African ancestry through that line. Another one of her great-granddaughters did like the Ancestry.com test, and she came back with 18% Native American ancestry, which is extremely high for African Americans, which would have been about equivalent if she would have been half Native American. And they say she was extremely mean. She read fortunes with decks of cards, and she poisoned one of her daughters-in-law to death that she didn't like. This is a white family of sharecroppers at Westington, and tobacco production is very backbreaking and dirty labor, so you can tell by the expression on these little boys' faces that they're not thrilled about being out there. And this is another former slave. Some of her family intermarried into some of the Washington families. She was born a slave in 1840, and she was married to Alfred Pitt, who was born in 1830. And at one time, he was the largest African-American landowner in Robertson County. And he had blacks and whites sharecropping for him. So his wife filed for divorce in 1900. And she stated that he was extremely mean to her. He hadn't bought a decent dress in about 7 years, and when he bought that, that was the cheapest that he could find. She said she had helped him acquire everything that he owned. She had 11 children by him. So his position was, well, you know, we married back when we were slaves, and we haven't married since, so technically, you're not my wife. I don't have to give you anything. So she consulted her former owner, who was a judge, and he found a law, which some states passed laws if you were formerly enslaved, so this is a situation a lot of people found themselves in. So I'm married to a lady. I have 2 or 3 kids by her, and so I end up getting sold. So then I marry another woman, and I have kids, and then I end up getting sold again. Then I marry someone else, have kids. So after emancipation, some states say you're going to have to choose, John, which one of these women is going to be your wife. So Tennessee made that easy. So they said if you continued living as husband and wife, that legally made you husband and wife. You didn't have to remarry anything. So they cited that, and they made her husband give her $1,000 in cash, 100 acres of land, a horse, buggy, and so many pigs and chickens. So one of their great-great-grandsons said, John, if our ancestors had all that land and everything, why don't we have anything else? And I said, well, your ancestors sided with the father, and then some of the others with the mother, because they had 11 kids, half of them sided, and they had a deposition where they signed statements and all this. So half went with the mother, half went with the father. And all those that went with the mother, he disinherited. So that's what happened with them. And this is George A. Washington in the late 1890s before he passed away. This is the plantation in 1892, and it encompassed 13,100 acres. He wanted his son, Joseph E. Washington, who was a congressman, to have what was called the home place, and the rest of the children drew lots out of a hat to determine what part of the plantation they would receive as their inheritance. And this is the Washington family in 1891, and my family's photograph was taken the same day, at the same time. This is the Westington Mansion, and after Mr. Washington passed away, his children got their inheritance, so his son, George A. Washington II, built this home called Washington Hall. It had 44 rooms, it was 3 stories, white brick. It had a ballroom on the upper floor that could accommodate 250 guests. Have any of you all seen Gone with the Wind? Scarlett O'Hara, and you recall the staircase that Scarlett O'Hara falls down. It was fashioned after the staircase in this house, and some of the crowned heads of Europe, such as the Prince of Greece, had been entertained there. Mr. Washington's daughter, Jane Washington Ewan, built this home called Glen Raven, and she and her brother stayed in a fierce competition with one another, having lavish parties. They would invite all the who's who in Nashville and have parties that lasted for days, and they ended up going broke competing with one another and lost their homes. In 2014, the direct descendants of the slaveholders donated funds to have a monument erected in the slave cemetery at Westington. Individuals who were buried there from 1798 to 1928. And we had a dedication ceremony, and there was probably 250 various African Americans who were there whose ancestors had been enslaved at Westington. And there was about 50 of the white Washington family members that were there. And this is a photograph of some of the descendants that attended. And this is the family reunion that my side of the family had, the Washingtons in 2000, and we've been having the Washington family reunion for about 70 years, I guess. And at that time, my great aunt Maggie Washington was 97, and she had 6 generations of her family there. She was there, her children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, and great-great-great-grandchildren. And let me show you all a family tree that I've done. I did this by hand, and this is my family tree. It starts in 1760 and goes down to 2012. And it took me 12 hours to do this. And so I've done these for all of the families from the plantation, in addition to my own. so when I do these by hand, they can be reduced down to 11 by 17, so at family reunions, everyone gets a copy of it. So everyone gets a copy of these at family reunions, so they can keep up with their relationships. This is another family that I did, the Terry family, and it's about 1,500 names on this, and this took me 36 hours to read. This is a computer-generated family tree for the Gardner family, who was also enslaved. So when they're done this way, they can't be reduced. So I just put this one tree up at the family reunions, and everyone checks them out to see who they're related to and all that. And this particular family, the Gardner family, they've been having a family reunion every year since 1935, except for one of the COVID years. I also have in my book a 5-generation photograph of one of my cousins who passed away when she was 95. So in this photograph, which was taken in 1928, she was 3 years old. So it's of her, her mother, her grandmother, her great-grandmother, and her great-great-grandmother, 5 generations. And she lived to see 5 generations of her family, so she's actually seen 9 generations of her family. So it's probably not that many people in the world that could say that. And most of the time in that particular family, they've never had under 4 generations living at the same time. In 1983, the Washington family sold Westington to Glenn and Donald Roberts, and they greatly restored the place. Mr. Roberts passed away in November of last year at age 91. This is the monument in the slave cemetery there. This is a restored slave cabin, and this is the Washington family cemetery, which is close to the main house. And this is where I did a book signing at Barnes & Noble when my book first came out, and there were several African American family represented and a number of the white Washington family members. And the white Washington family has been very supportive of my research since the very beginning. And these are some of the families that have family reunions there at Westington. And in 2014, the Tennessee State Museum did an exhibit, and there was about 70,000 people that attended. So some of the white Washingtons came. So I have been telling them for years, because I know different pockets of them more so than they know each other. And I said, y'all need to have a family reunion. Y'all don't even know each other. So when they did the exhibit, some of them came to tour that. So as part of that tour, I took them out to Westington. So I suggested that they take a photograph in the same spot that their ancestor did in 1891 as my family did. So they were just standing there, and I said, what is it? And they said, well, John, you need to get in this picture, because if it wasn't for you, we would have never known each other. And the book and all the research is not just my family, it's, you know, everyone that was ever enslaved there in the white Washington family as well. So in the book, I think there's about 100 photographs. So this particular lady was Jane Washington, and she knew how to cure various illnesses using herbs and plants. So when some of the slaves were sick, they went to her instead of opting to go to the white doctor. This is Granville Washington. He was said to be the son of George A. Washington, who was the owner of the plantation. He passed away in 1898, and these 3 are his children. And these are some of the other photographs that are in the book also. And Nelson Washington was instrumental in the 8th of August celebration in our town, which slavery officially ended in February of 1865. However, slaves passed on to their descendants. Not everyone was aware of the freedom until the 8th of August, so they celebrate that each year. this is some more photographs. And this is where I documented more than 200 years of my family, starting with me, my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, my great-great-great-grandmother, my great-great-great-grandmother, 4 great. And of course, there was so much documentation, my editor told me that I had enough for 10 books, and so I would have to cut some down. So I'm working on another book with the genealogies of all the families, and it will have every enslaved person on the plantation, when they were born, when they died, if they were purchased on the plantation or born there, where they were living and all that. So future generations can get stop shopping all of that in one book. And the title of my book is The Washingtons of Wessyngton Plantation, Stories of My Family's Journey to Freedom, which I said is just not the history of my family. And I have a website, westington.com, if you want to check out more information. And these are some of the awards that I've won regarding the book and research. I was nominated for the Oprah Winfrey Book Club, but someone beat me out. They wrote a book about Thomas Jefferson having kids by Sally Henry. And I received a letter from the Queen of England about the book, and she was impressed that I spent so many years on the research. So her lady in waiting wrote me for her. And then I got a letter from Bill Clinton about the book also. And I traced Lionel Richie's route for a show called Who Do You Think You Are several years ago. I think in 2010. And I got to meet him. He was very nice. That concludes my presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it. At this time, I'll answer any questions you might have about my book or the research. Thank you.
We probably do have about 5 minutes for questions. If anyone has a question, just raise your hand.
Yes.
What do you think is the next stage of your work here with the genealogy?
The genealogy will probably go on forever because it's probably not a week that passes by that someone from somewhere contacts me about their ancestors who were at Westington. So that will probably go on forever. Yes.
I haven't finished reading your book, but I know there's a section on DNA, and I was wondering, has the DNA research that's been coming up just in the past 10 years transformed the way you approach your genealogy?
Yeah, it settles some cases of relationships to one another, some paternity, like a number of people have been adopted and they didn't know that they had Westington ties, so I've helped some individuals with that also. So that continues to grow. Yes?
What do you believe to be your greatest achievement with this research?
Getting the book published by Simon and Schuster. For years and years, my mother had told me, she said, you've been saying that you're going to write a book and you've got documents under your bed and drawers in the closet everywhere. And she said, a lot of those older people that you interviewed are gone. And she said, no one else can get that information back, so you really need to get it in a book. So that's probably the greatest achievement so far. Yes.
You mentioned you drew some trees by hand and that one was computer generated?
Yes.
I guess, what's kind of the difference in process there besides time investment?
Okay, basically I take a blank sheet of paper, post it to the wall, and then just start drawing from the earliest ancestor and then come down each generation. And it fans out. So I have a form that I pass out to individuals at family reunions. So I have them to list as far back as they know their ancestors, put their children, grandchildren, who's kid and all that. And then I can lay it out. And the family tree maker program, you just key all that in and print the tree, but everyone doesn't want a tree that large, so I can't reduce it to 11 by 17 with the computer generated. So the handwriting works out best. Yes?
Do you feel any animosity towards the Washingtons?
Any part? No. I mean, they can't help what happened any more than I could. But they've all been very supportive. One guy, he was instrumental in getting the fence put up around the family cemetery. He gave me $22,000 to have that done, and then the monument was over $50,000. And when I was doing the book, he said, John is working on our family's history just like he is his, and if y'all got pictures, portraits, whatever, y'all need to cough it up and help him out. So they've been very supportive over the years. Yes?
The amount of people that you've like interviewed is really impressive, but are there any like specific people that you can remember that was really just like motivating when after the interview?
Probably Maddie Terry, because she was closer to that, because she was a daughter of a slave, and so her great grandmother was probably the oldest, so that had that connection going back the furthest. So probably she was. Yes.
What questions do you still have? Or like what are you curious about now?
Pretty much I got everything answered so far. It's the other people have questions for me. Someone over here. Yes.
How long did it take to compile your research and eventually write this book? What was the overall time frame?
Okay, I've been collecting research for many, many years, so I guess about 2 years I got it all together to do the book. But I like all those names, dates, and all of that. I have that in my head, so I don't rarely have to even refer back to a document, because I've got like an image in my mind. Like that list, I can just about tell you from 1796 down who's born when and who's kin to who and all that. So a lot of people not even connected to Westington will say, "Hey John, such and such said I'm their cousin. Am I?" And I said, "Yeah, your great grandmother and their great grandfather were sister and brother, so you're third cousins." Yes.
You dealt with such an amazing wealth of both written documents and oral documents. Were there any moments where, there was a sort of surprising clash between oral and written documents, or did the oral documents confirm the written?
Yeah, there were not any conflicts, and I was very fortunate with the documentation supported all the oral history. So that's extremely rare that you have both. So I was fortunate in that. Yes.
So, if I wanted to go out and find out about my own family, what piece of advice would you give to me, or like, what would be a good first step?
I would say first start with your family. Are your grandparents living?
Yes.
I would say start with your grandparents and get as much information as you can from them. You have any great-grandparents living?
No, I do not.
Okay, so get as much information as you can from your grandparents and other older relatives, and then you can do the research. The documentation will always be here now, but your family members won't. So I always encourage people to start with the family members first and then work backwards. Anyone else? Yes.
What sources beyond your family, where do you go in the public domain, I guess, to find out more about your family?
Okay, I used wills, deeds, court cases, death certificates. I've got probably 1,000 death certificates. I've got wills I've got practical a library at home, so I've got all that information, obituaries, you name it, I've got it. Yes.
Not a question, but a comment. It's just really inspiring, like the amount of passion that you have and everything you know.
Right.
It's just like very inspiring, and glad that we got to.
Right. Anyone else?
That's a great comment, and thank you, John, for the visit and the talk. It was wonderful. Let's give John another round.